This episode discusses crime scenes, death, and autopsy. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. 2 years ago, we launched a season covering the 22 unidentified persons cold cases of Nashville, Tennessee. And the story that most attracted the attention of our listeners was that of a woman who was known as Vandy Jane Doe. Her remains were discovered in 2018 in the stiflingly hot early days of September, hidden along Sulphur Creek Road. Around the first of that month, county crews had mowed the area in northwest Davidson County, and they'd noticed nothing wrong. That event became one clear marker in the time for investigators, a narrow window in which someone had driven down the road, someone who did not want to be seen. At some point after that crew came through, a young woman's body was placed 4 or 5 feet off the road in what police reports describe as a ditch or a culvert. She'd been purposely obscured with branches and other vegetation, and it would be several more days, not until September 8th of 2018, before witnesses came upon her remains and called authorities. As one resident told Fox 17 at the time, quote, "I thought that was pitiful. It was sad. It was a precious person whose life was ripped away as a piece of trash on the side of the road." Investigators arrived to find the victim in an advanced state of decomposition. There were no obvious signs of trauma and no indication of a roadway accident. Because she'd been hidden, it was clear someone else had been involved, if not in her death, then in the aftermath. And one detail was immediately apparent. She had been dressed nearly head to toe in Vanderbilt University-branded clothing. Per the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, her apparel included a black quarter-zip Under Armour top with Vandy and gold stitching, Zuzat's brand black leggings bearing the Vanderbilt logo, and a black running hip band with a zip pocket. She was also wearing a black and green leopard print sports bra and a white metal rope-style necklace. That distinctive clothing became a touchstone for the investigation, and it turned out for public attention too. It was the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that gave her the name that most people came to know her by. So she became known as Vandy Jane Doe, and she would carry that name for more than 7 years. Theories swirled. She was a student, a former student, a woman in town for the Beyoncé concert who dressed up in Vanderbilt colors for the occasion. Perhaps she was a long-term missing person, and maybe even a well-known one from out of state. Vanderbilt confirmed that no students had gone missing at the start of the school year, and deeper searches did not turn up any other young women with Vanderbilt ties, not that matched her initial description. Investigators worked with a medical examiner and a forensic anthropologist to build a profile. Initially, she was estimated to be between 15 and 25 years old, described as Black and possibly Hispanic or Latina, and between 5 feet and 5 foot 5 inches tall. Drugs, cocaine metabolite, and morphine were present in her system. Nobody, it seemed, had filed a report to list her among the missing. So as now retired Detective Matthew Filter of the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department told WKRN in 2022, they made the decision to exhume her remains for forensic investigative genetic genealogy, a choice that would lead to a revised description, age, ancestry, and eventually her identification. We covered the woman then known as Vandy Jane Doe as part of our Tennessee Doe series, and we returned to her case in our Doe's Identified Update episode with Detective Filter in the spring of 2025. In both episodes, he released information that was meant to aid an investigation. But the big breakthrough, at least for forensic investigative genetic genealogists, was announced in that second episode. By then, new developments had emerged. A forensic anthropologist had revised her estimated age upward to 21 to 35 years old. Othram Lab had developed a comprehensive SNP DNA profile from new biological samples for forensic investigative genetic genealogy, which had in turn been uploaded to Family Tree DNA and to GEDmatch Pro, and genealogy work was actively underway. The surnames of Mangarelli and Moore were appearing on the Italian and African American sides of her tree, respectively. As Detective Filter told us in that update, 80 different possible matches had come in through tips, and the majority had already been excluded. Eventually, Filter would send more names for us to pass on to social media, surnames that could connect Vandy Jane Doe to a family in one of several states, including Georgia, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Mississippi. The new last names were Brunetti, Segretti, Albatroni, and Butler. For our part, we received at least a dozen emails and messages from volunteer genetic genealogists who were working on the case on their own or in groups, and we passed every tip or exclusion comparison on to Detective Filter. He retired from the force at the end of 2025 after a year of Doe identifications announced by MNPD. But Vandy Jane Doe, she remained unidentified. Then, on February 4th, 2026, the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department issued a press release. Vandy Jane Doe was identified as Yadezia Jones of Nashville, who was 25 years old when she died. Despite how she was found, dressed head to toe in Vanderbilt gear, Jones had no known connection to the university. The cause and manner of her death remain undetermined. The identification came through forensic investigative genetic genealogy. Per the Nashville Police press release, in September of 2025, a new team, the nonprofit known as DNA Investigative Solutions, was given access to the DNA profile that Othram had developed, and the identification followed from those combined efforts. The medical examiner's office, the University of North Texas's initial STR profile, and Metro Nashville's own detective work was also essential to the solve. DNA Investigative Solutions first heard of Vandy Jane Doe's case through our podcast. So, after the identification was made, they reached out to us about sitting down for a conversation, and we were glad that they did. In this episode, you'll hear from 3 genealogists at DNA Investigative Solutions who worked to bring Yadezia home: Krista Ellis, Beth Ann Davis, and Tanya Geraci. You'll also hear from the investigator who carried this case over the finish line, Cold Case Unit Detective Andrew Davis of MNPD, and from retired Detective Matthew Filter, who worked Vandy Jane Doe's case from the beginning and never stopped. We spoke with the current and retired detective and the 3 investigative genetic genealogists separately in February of 2026. When we sat down with Detective Davis and retired Detective Filter, Filter began with a review of the case and the department's initial discoveries. So, Detective Filter, you worked this case from, I believe, 2018 until your retirement at the end of 2025. Can you walk us through how the investigation evolved over those years?
Yeah, so I'll just recap it a little bit. On September 8th, 2018, a body was found in the ditch on Sulphur Creek Road in the Whites Creek area of Nashville, Davidson County. She was discovered by a couple driving down the road after a bird had dragged the skull into the roadway. The initial investigation indicated the body was dumped at the location and had been there for several days due to the advanced state of decomposition. After the medical examiner and anthropology examination, the victim was confirmed to be female and likely African descent. As with any other unidentified human remains case, or UHR case as we refer to them as, we take whatever information we can glean from the remains and get that information entered into any databases to try and find a match. So information that we would have entered would have been standard information such as relative height, sex, race, hair color, age, clothing description, known circumstances surrounding the death, etc. One of the unique descriptors with her was she was wearing all Vanderbilt University athletic attire, which is how she eventually became known as Vandy Doe. A few tips came in initially, but were all quickly unfounded. When Vandy Doe was found in 2018, the UHR cases in Nashville were worked by the precinct investigation units until they were officially deemed a cold case. Now, I had initially responded to the scene and was assisting the precinct investigation detectives So I helped with the case for the first few days and then didn't have anything to do with it until around April of 2022. At that time, NCMEC, or the National Center for Missing Exploited Children, had opened a case on Vandy Doe because she was believed to possibly be as young as 15 years. I started working with NCMEC, who created a forensic rendering of Vandy Doe to have disseminated publicly. We also did research on the clothing, which included tracking down the manufacturer and possible points of sale, as well as sending the clothing to a lab for pollen analysis to see if we could determine what part of the country, or the world for that matter, she may have come from. A mass media dissemination was done, which generated several tips. Unfortunately, they were all unfounded, or we were unable to verify them at the time because of no dental or DNA information. Vandy Doe's DNA was uploaded to CODIS in 2019, and no hits had been generated. With all leads exhausted, in about August of 2022, we decided to move forward with forensic genetic genealogy. Unfortunately, at that time, there was no sample from Vandy Doe available for advanced forensic testing. So we had to go through the process of exhuming her body to collect a new biological sample. This was done on September 13th of 2022. And by December 2022, a sample was sent to Othram Lab to start FGG. The genealogy makeup of Vandy Doe's DNA revealed she was half African and half Italian descent. The genealogy research also revealed several surnames we could use to start tracking family lines. We released relevant information publicly as we felt appropriate to get her identified. The information led to hundreds of tips. In August of 2025, DNA Investigative Solutions had reached out to me regarding the case. They had been working on the case and felt if they had access to everything Othram had, they could get Vandy Doe identified quickly. I initially wasn't interested in having the case reassigned to someone else. I had received requests for information from genealogists all over the world and thought DNA Investigative Solutions was just another one of the many genealogists wanting to solve the case, which I appreciate any help in getting a case solved, but it would have been irresponsible for any investigator to hand over an entire case to someone without some kind of vetting. Othram had had the case for over 2 years and had done a lot of work on the case. And I've got to give Othram credit for building the tree as far as they did, because they did do a lot of work on it. But over the last several months, the case seemed to have stalled. So after talking to DNA Investigative Solutions a few times and what their plan would be, which was to take a team approach to get her identified, I decided to pass the case to them. I had had a similar experience with the Cumberland River Jane Doe case, where a couple genealogists worked the case for a couple years and couldn't seem to break through. So I sent that case to the DNA Doe Project. DNA Doe Project put a team together and had the case solved in 3 months. So I was hoping for a similar outcome giving the case to DNA Investigative Solutions, and it paid off.
Cumberland Jane Doe was also known as Leo Jane Doe, and we covered her in an earlier season, along with the still unidentified Jane Doe known as Sherry or Cheryl. Leo Jane Doe was identified as Diane Miner in July of 2024.
So Detective Filter handed the case off to me at the end of October of 2025. He updated me on the case and advised that he was having DNA Investigative Solutions work on the forensic investigative genetic genealogy. It was still early on in their work, so no close family connections had been made at that time, but they had people that they already wanted me to interview and get reference samples from, and also some birth and death records that they wanted me to get as well. They really, from the get-go, were just hard chargers, and I really appreciated their work and their effort. I felt like they really took this case personally and wanted to see it brought to resolution. So on Saturday morning, December 20th, 2025, I received a text from Tanya with DNA Investigative Solutions. She advised that they had a new highest match to Vandy Doe, a male who shared 690 centimorgans with Vandy Doe, showing him to be a likely first half cousin to Vandy Doe. They had miraculously gotten information that that subject's grandfather had a son that had connections to Nashville, Tennessee, and they believe that that son may possibly be Vandy Doe's father. I was actually about to travel out of town to spend time with family for Christmas, but I brought my computer home from the office anticipating that I may get a call from them. I spent that whole Saturday morning and afternoon with DNA Investigative Solutions trying to figure out who Vandy Doe was, basically trying to get in touch with that possible father and doing research on him and his family. I was finally able to speak with a family member of his who gave me the name of his child's mother, which ultimately led me to the name of Yadezia Jones. And when I saw her license photo, I was certain that she was going to be Vandy Doe. I think I described the moment as a little bit as a somber moment, realizing that this was the victim in this case. But obviously, I was also elated that we had finally, after all the years of work, we had gotten the likely answer as to who the victim was in this case.
We will return to the detectives, but now seems like a good time to introduce the investigative genetic genealogist whose work identified Yadezia Jones, DNA Investigative Solutions, a recently formed nonprofit. Krista Ellis, one of the founders, reached out to us regarding the case, and we sat down with her, Beth Ann Davis, and Tanya Geraci to discuss their work. You'll hear all three genealogists participating in this discussion.
So, can you describe how and when you became aware of the woman that we then knew as Vandy Jane Doe?
Absolutely. We had individually listened to the Fall Line podcast that featured Detective Filter and the surnames, the story about Vandy. He gave the surnames publicly that had been identified by DNA. And many of us took those surnames and started building our own trees. The three of us met on social media and continued working on that separately together in the evenings. And then one night I said, we work really well together. We're never going to figure her out without the DNA. Do we want to continue doing this work and find other Doe cases? And we kind of agreed that that's what we would do. And so we formed the nonprofit. And now here we are, back where we began on the Fall Line podcast.
So in the NBC article I read covering the identification of Yadezia, also known as Vandy Jane Doe, you mentioned that you've been working on her case, quote, for a while before even having access to her DNA profile. Can you talk about what that entailed for listeners who kind of think that you have to have DNA to do the work?
Sure. Before we even had access to her DNA profile, we were already trying to understand who she might be, just based off of the surnames. We pulled together every NamUs case that even loosely matched a description of her and researched each person that we pulled off a NamUs that was reported missing. So we went through old yearbooks, social media, anything we could find at that point, because all we had were the surnames the Detective Filter had provided during the podcast. So we spent a lot of time on social media going through things. It didn't take us very far, but it gave us a point to start at before we even saw the DNA profile.
So once you saw the DNA profile, this was still what you described as a multi-step process to the media. It involved clustering matches, building family trees. Can you walk us through specifically how Yadezia's case unfolded?
It was a big challenge. There was many matches that had unclear parentage, and we kept running into different rabbit holes and solving small mysteries for those matches themselves and understanding how they connected to the Doe. Detective Filter had given us permission to reach out to anyone we needed to. And then Detective Andrew Davis would get phone calls to make sure we were legitimate. And then he would confirm that. We spent a lot of time helping matches get their trees together and looking for union couples and see how everything tied together. It was slow, detailed, and those small clues and the help from the matches is what moved this case forward.
Right before Thanksgiving, we got a higher match in GEDmatch, and that helped us focus on a particular branch a little more. And around that same time, one of our team members had seen something a little off in a census. There was a grandson with a surname that didn't match anyone else in the household. And the grandmother was someone we already suspected as a likely ancestor of the Doe. And we were able to, because of that information, putting together that higher match and putting together that kind of suspicious census entry, we asked another person to test as a reference tester, and that person came back even higher to the Doe. And so that really gave us a place to focus. And using that, we had a place that looked very suspicious. And that individual from the census had no children on record. So we knew this person was a likely ancestor, but there were no documented children. But fortunately, people in communities and neighborhoods often know family history that is not documented. Andrew gave us some information, and he made a few phone calls and came back and said, yeah, I found a family member that no one has heard from in several years.
So as we discussed on the podcast, this is a case that involved African American and Italian American ancestry, and there were family connections in various states, including Louisiana, Texas, and Georgia. Can you tell me how those details helped you or complicated your research?
So Texas and Georgia didn't really end up being very significant in our research. Louisiana was a little more significant, and then it was really Mississippi and Tennessee that ended up being the important locations for this case. There were some complications with Mississippi because a flood in 1927 had destroyed some of the census records and other records. Tanya worked with the Sunflower Public History Coordinator, and they were really instrumental in getting us some records that we needed from that area that we couldn't get otherwise. One major complication, which was not geographical, is that unfortunately slavery creates blind spots in the records. So with the African American DNA, we had a lot of very low centimorgan matches, and we would lose those lines prior to like the mid 1800s because of slavery. And that makes it very hard to find the most recent common ancestor when you just lose that line altogether. So that was a major complication.
So one thing that I remember really clearly from the information that Detective Filter gave to me when he first appeared on the show were the importance of a couple of surnames. And there were several, but Butler, Moore, Mangarelli, they were identified early on. Did those names end up being key, or did the solution come from a different branch of the family tree?
Those surnames didn't actually end up being the key. The Mangarelli surname was the one everyone focused on early because it was publicly released. And the matches from that family were incredibly kind. We spent many, many hours on phone calls and Zoom with them, just trying to find out how they connect. But there was no paper trail at all from that surname to Yadezia. We have a suspicion on which Mangarelli male way back in the tree is her ancestor, but that's only speculation on our part. And the solution came from an entirely different surname.
The DNA profile for Yadezia was uploaded to Family Tree DNA, GEDmatch Pro, maybe DNA Justice as well. Can you explain how those databases, which we spend so much time talking about on the show, how did they contribute to your work?
Those databases were essential to our work. That's where we could see how the DNA matched to the Doe and how many centimorgans each match to the Doe, and how they matched one another, clustering them. And then we would look to see who matched on the X chromosome as well. You're doing all types of things when you're, trying to look. Maybe you'll get a high match on the X chromosome. We were doing that, and that all helped us understand which side of the family a match belonged to. And that just helped us understand the shared match patterns and allowed us to start building their family lines into the bigger picture.
We actually received the DNA around September 7th or 8th and started working on it by December 20th, which I believe is the Saturday before Christmas. That morning, we had identified a person of interest that could have been her match and reached out to Detective Davis. And he started making a couple calls and had confirmed that. So in less than 90 days, we were able to find who Yadezia was as a missing person and get a family member to come in and trace test with the Nashville Police Department.
Can I add something? So I did not go to sleep before 5 a.m. any night from September 7th until like December 20th. And part of that was because we were trying so hard to solve this before Matt Filter retired.
I asked the team about the importance of public uploads to databases, GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice.
Those uploads were absolutely critical. This case would not have been solved without the matches that eventually led us to Yadezia. One small centimorgan match on its own might not mean much, but when you put a cluster of many small centimorgan matches together, you start to see those patterns that identify a shared great-grandparent, great-great-grandparent, even farther back in the tree. And those clusters give us a section of the family tree to focus on. From there, we can build forward, and when appropriate, that's when we can ask a relative to reference test to rule a line either in or out. Every person who uploads their DNA helps create those clusters, and that is what makes cases like this solvable. We cannot solve these cases without people uploading their DNA. That's what makes our work possible. The matches in GEDmatch, DNA Justice, and Family Tree DNA are what allow us to see the patterns. They allow us to build the family lines and eventually identify a doe. If you want to help, the most impactful thing that you can do is take a consumer DNA test and upload to the law enforcement databases. GEDmatch, you must opt in for law enforcement matching, and then Family Tree DNA and DNA Justice. More matches make identifications faster and more accurate. And especially for people in the communities that are underrepresented in the databases, that's usually ethnic minorities, we need you to upload because every match truly matters for a case.
And this was a 7-year-old case when it was solved. And it's something I really want people to understand, and I hope you'll explain. The process of IgG and kind of the perceived quick fix that people may perceive comes with IgG. You know, people are always saying, run the DNA, whatever that means online. But I'd really like to talk about what you want people to understand about that approach and why it's not as fast as some people think it should be or assume it will be.
Well, as important as investigative genetic genealogy is for this time period, it isn't a quick fix. It isn't a magic wand. Some cases come together in hours. You may have a DNA profile that gets uploaded and there's already DNA there that matches high. Sometimes there's no matches or really, really low matches. So that can complicate things, but it could take hours. It could take days. It could take months or even years if you have low matches. So you're limited to certain records, complicated family histories. So even if what you think is a high match, sometimes you still have to build out those trees, and that's a tedious process to make sure it makes sense, right? So we often build full trees for every single match that we have in GEDmatch or FTDNA to get to that one key person that it could be, or the family or the line it could be.
This is a case that so many people have followed and cared about and shared. It's something that really stuck with me, that her case really struck a chord with our listeners, with folks that would just follow on social media who didn't even listen to the podcast, message boards, the genealogical community, everyone. So I'd be really interested to hear about what lessons you feel that you may have learned from Yadezia's case that might inform your work in the future, because I know this was a difficult solve.
Never give up. Even when the case is challenging, you just got to keep working it. You can take, as Beth just mentioned, a very small match, and it could actually be a line that's documented well. There's lots of different family lines. You just need to work them, and circumstances become complicated, and you just got to keep going. I would just say being patient and not giving up and just staying committed. You just keep things moving forward, just chugging along, and that's how you get it done.
We'll pick back up here with Detectives Filter and Davis. Detective Davis walked us through what came after the initial identification of Yadezia Jones. I asked both detectives about the ongoing difficulty in connecting missing and unidentified persons.
The same day that I came across the name Yadezia Jones, I was able to make contact with a very close family member who pretty much confirmed to me that they had not seen or heard from her since 2018. And they were eager to want to answer any questions that we had and trying to get as much information as we could. So the family did say that they were receiving sightings of Yadezia Jones around town, and actually from family members who believed that they had seen her. So they had kind of assumed that she was okay and just living her life. And I know that I would definitely tell families that if they have a loved one that they haven't heard from in some time, to try to make contact with them. And if they're not able to get in touch with them, I think it would be worth them filing a missing persons report.
Yeah, for sure. If a missing persons report isn't filed, then no one knows the person is missing and no one knows to be looking for the person. When no missing persons report is on file for a UHR, there is no way for law enforcement and coroners, medical examiners to make a connection in any of the databases at our disposal. But it goes beyond the report. Biometric information is extremely important in missing persons cases. DNA, fingerprints, dental records, along with the most recent photo available, to include all the person's tattoos and scars if they have any, and medical records, especially if they have had some type of major surgery where they are walking around with hardware. All of this needs to be provided in order to have the best possible outcome, especially if the missing person becomes a UHR. My advice to families, if you haven't heard from a family member or even a close friend in a while, and you can't get a hold of them or find them, make a report. Oftentimes, law enforcement can track a person down within a few days and verify their welfare. But if the missing person isn't located in a few days, then make sure to give law enforcement the biometric information. The more law enforcement has to work with, the better the chances of them locating and or identifying the missing person.
The investigation has found no ties between Yadezia and Vanderbilt University, but there is the possibility that she received those items from Vanderbilt Hospital. Her family's comments to outlets indicate that she was released from care there shortly before her death. But Detective Davis says that he's still tracking leads in that area. The more he knows about when and where she got that clothing, the higher the likelihood is that he might get a clue to what she was doing in the days before her death. We're also aware of an arrest and release in late August of 2018, but how that might relate is unknown.
Did the lack of Vanderbilt connection surprise you, given how thoroughly she was dressed in that clothing? And is there something that we can take from that in terms of how we make assumptions regarding potential clues in identification?
I think Detective Filter had already really thoroughly investigated that aspect, that it really wasn't a surprise to me. And it's obviously a great potential lead in helping us try to identify her, but it definitely is a reminder that you have to have a broad focus. And obviously, just because I have an authentic Tennessee Titans jersey, it doesn't mean that I play defensive end for them. But I think it was a great potential lead for us.
Yeah, I agree. It wasn't a surprise to me. I've found that although clothing often holds some kind of identity for the person, it isn't an absolute. An open mind has to be maintained in every aspect of an investigation until it is either proven or disproven. In the case of the Vanderbilt clothing, we never found any connection to Vanderbilt. And we had several leads that we looked into over the years, but no connection of any kind was ever established. And that even goes back to working with Vanderbilt. They assisted with checking their student rosters for any students that may have abruptly dropped out or just didn't show up for class when they were registered, even looking at employees for the university and the hospital. They weren't able to identify anybody associated with the university or the hospital or students.
We know that Yadezia's cause and manner of death are undetermined and likely may remain that way.
based on a number of factors that just limit scientific analysis. Now that you have her identity, though, what investigative avenues have opened up?
So obviously, we're trying to find out as much information about Miss Jones as possible. Her family's been very cooperative with us, telling us about her and answering any questions that we have. And I know that she also had a small social media footprint that we're looking into as well. And really, we're just trying to speak with as many people that knew her to try to get as much information about her as possible. I feel like that we're really just trying to piece together the last few weeks of her life, trying to find out who she was hanging out with in late August, early September of 2018. I believe that someone out there knows what happened to her. And I just hope that someone will call to let us know, or at least let us know who she was hanging out with.
Yadezia's case was one of 22 that we covered with Detective Filter. And since then, a number of the victims have been identified. I asked the retired detective how the resolution of one Doe case might affect others that are still open.
Well, I think getting a case like this one solved often draws attention to the other cases. Solving these cases is definitely a great motivation to keep going, because if a UHR case this difficult can get solved, then the other ones are solvable too. And that's what working these cases is all about, giving the victim their identity back and reuniting them with their family. And if their death was a result of foul play, then doing everything within our ability to hold the person responsible for their death accountable. I think cold cases are some of the hardest cases to solve. The older they are, the more difficult. It is hard for just one person to solve a case on their own. Most cases are solved through collaboration with several people with various expertise. And the public also plays an important role in the investigation because, with the exception of forensic evidence, we have to rely on the public to come forward with information. And that is where a lot of our leads are generated from. I believe any case can be solved. It's just a matter of talking to the right people and getting those people to give us the information we need. And technology is constantly advancing. In fact, it's advancing at a pace that it's becoming hard to keep up with. I see many of the newer cases being easier to solve as time goes on. I mean, just look at the Doe cases that we've covered. Some of those cases were 30 or 40 years old, and at the time, no one thought they could be solved. And here we are today identifying the unidentified, closing missing persons cases, and arresting killers that thought they got away with it. So we won't ever give up as long as we have things to work with, and neither should a family.
Detective Davis, he wants to highlight people and organizations that made Yadezia's identification possible.
The University of North Texas Center for Human Identification did the original DNA work, uploaded Vandy Doe's profile to CODIS, and they also ultimately did the familial testing to confirm that Vandy Doe was in fact Yadezia Jones. Authored and developed the SNP DNA profile for Vandy Doe and uploaded it to the appropriate websites. And they also did the initial genetic genealogy in this case. DNA Investigative Solutions took over the investigative genetic genealogy in this case in September of 2025. They did phenomenal work. They worked around the clock and encountered numerous hurdles with this family tree, but ultimately led us to identifying Vandy Doe as Yadezia in just 3 months. And then I would also like to mention our medical examiner's office. On top of all their investigations and working with us and determining cause and manner of death in a lot of our cases, they do relentless work on our unidentified human remains cases. They're with us every step of the way and trying to give them their names back.
Yadezia Jones has been identified, and our thoughts are with her family as they navigate what comes next. As we told you, the cause and manner of her death remain undetermined, and Detective Davis is still piecing together the last weeks of her life, trying to find out who she was with and what happened to her in those final days. If you knew Yadezia or know anything about who she was spending time with in late August or early September of 2018, please contact Cold Case Unit Detective Andrew Davis at 615-862-7720. You can learn more about DNA Investigative Solutions in our show notes. We'll be back soon with our next season, and this month, you'll also hear about the cold case homicide of Darren Gray, which we're revisiting in hopes of generating tips and leads. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes that we care about. Our therapy fund is paid for through Patreon and Apple Premium subscriptions. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. That really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to check your subscription to make sure that you're set for automatic downloads so that you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, is out everywhere. Find out more through the link in our show notes. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton. Interviews by Laura Norton and Brooke Hargrove. Engineered by Southern Gothic Media and Rachel Boyd. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka.